Well, hello everybody. It is time for yet another Native American flute lesson, which I think is fantastic. I love these things, and so I'm so excited to be able to talk a little bit about, the flute and how it works, and how you can become a better player, and how you can become a better musician, and how you can become a better performer. Because there's some really, really interesting aspects about actually being a good performer, being a good musician, and actually becoming better at it. I think one of the first things that any musician or any performer who wants to get better at has to do is they have to understand a little bit about their instrument in more ways than just kind of the basic notes, right? Yeah, and learning the notes is good, and learning how to play on it is fine. But if you really want to be a good performer, you got to kind of like infuse the instrument into you, right? You got to be part of the instrument. It's got to be part of, take a hold of you, and you've got to be able to, adapt and change and play whatever you want to. It's not just enough to be able to read notes off a page. It's more about you creating your own vocabulary, you utilizing the language that's been provided to you, and expressing yourself in the right fashion. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about being a performer, about being a musician, about being an artist, is that you are able to express yourself in terms of that not a lot of other people can maybe understand, or maybe not, maybe appreciate, right? The flute itself is such a cool instrument. It's so easy to pick up. It's so simple to get into. If you've been following these lessons at all, you see how simple it is to get into. All I'm doing is explaining maybe a couple of ideas here or there, maybe shedding a little bit of light or a little bit of insight inside of how other ideas and other concepts work on the flute that you might not be aware of, and then allowing you to go off and perform and start building your own expression library so that you can create the best version of like music in the world for you, right? That's the cool thing. You have a sound that no one else does. I have a sound that no one else does. We can kind of like mimic each other and try to get to sound the same, but truth be told, your expression is going to be a lot different than my expression. The way I perform is going to be a lot different than the way other people perform. And that's the beautiful thing about music, is just that you have that ability to perform, to adapt, and make it your own. And that's what we're trying to get to here. Now, when we look back 2 lessons ago, we introduced a very, very interesting concept. And again, we're going to review, right? So we're reviewing at least 2 lessons old so that you kind of know where we're coming from and kind of understand where we're moving from. So when we look 2 lessons back, we introduced a really interesting concept, and I want to kind of dive a little bit more into that just today, a little bit more into the idea. And that interesting concept is the idea of the anchor finger and moving the anchor finger, and what does that do, right? So when we started off with our fingers being able to use like this. We had our anchor finger being this finger right here, the fourth finger right from the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, or the first finger on the top hand. I like it the fourth finger, it makes it easier, but if you want to use it as the first finger top hand, you can do that as well. But that's our anchor finger, and it stays there. The anchor finger doesn't move. That's the beautiful thing about the anchor finger. It just stays there. No moving, no change, no anything. It just stays there. So that when you play and you move your fingers one off the hole, right after each other, you end up getting a scale, and that scale is a pentatonic scale. More importantly, that scale is a minor pentatonic scale, and it sounds like this. Pretty simple. We've been talking about that the entire time. It's got notes, it's got names and notes, right? This is my E flute, and so my E flute, right? The E, we skip over the next letter. We get to G, G to A to B. We skip over the next letter. We get to C, right? And then we skip the next letter. Skip over C. We get D. Skip over D. Get to E, and that's our pentatonic scale, the E minor pentatonic scale. Now we're changing the anchor finger, and that's what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Changing the anchor finger, moving the anchor finger from this finger here to this finger here, actually having it be the third finger on the flute instead of the fourth finger on the flute. And what does this do? What does this allow us to do? How does this create a different type of expression for us? Well, it allows us to change the pentatonic scale ever so slightly, ever so slightly. So now we play, and it sounds like this. And you can hear there's a slight difference, just a very slight difference. The original pentatonic, our first pentatonic that we learned, and then this new alternate pentatonic with our new anchor finger. And that's the thing, right? The scales sound nice. They sound easy. And it makes it easy for us to transition between one to another because all we're really doing is changing an anchor finger. It's really not that big of a deal. However, there's a little bit more to it. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about that as we move on to today's lesson. But for the most part, we're talking about what we learned 2 lessons ago, and that was the alternating anchor finger or the changing. Now, what happens? Why does this work for us? Well, it works for us because we actually introduce one new note and we introduce this concept of alternate fingerings. Alternate fingerings are just a different way to finger to get the same type of pitch. So we're using a different fingering methodology to get the same type of pitch, right? And again, we know the names of the flutes, right? So on my E, we go E, then we move up 2, right? So E, F, G, you move up 1, A, move up again, B, skip over the next letter, C, get to D, then we go back to E. That's our normal fingerings. With our new alternate fingering, with our new anchor finger, we get a different set of fingerings. Now, you'll notice that the bottom hand is going to stay the same because we're actually not changing until we actually get to this note right here. So we're still at E. We skip over the next letter. So skip over F, get to G, then go to A. Okay, nothing's changed. That's all the same because of the same fingerings. Now, instead of getting to the next letter, which would have been a B, right, we skip over and we get to C. Then we go to D, and then we go to E. Now you'll notice here, this is the new E. Beforehand, our E again was up here where our anchor finger would have been. But now we actually are moving this to here, which is our new E. What that does is it gives us the ability to have the same pitch, but a different fingering to allow us to move back and forth. Now here's the trick, right? It actually might not be the same pitch. It might be a little bit sharp or a little bit flat, but it's so close that it allows us to have the same type of tonality, have the same type of hearing and melodic line in our ear so that it doesn't really sound too hard, too far off, okay? So here's the E on our normal or regular anchor finger. And I'm going to use the alternate fingering and get the same E again. And here's the thing, are they exactly the same? Again, they're slightly off, or they're just slightly off pitch from each other, but they're so close that we can call them the exact same note. And realistically, we're just getting it by just changing our way our fingers work. And that's the thing, is alternate fingerings allow us to change our fingers so that we can get patterns moving that are easier for us to play and easier for us to kind of adapt to as we move throughout the course of playing with the flute. Are there other alternate fingerings out there? Yeah, there's a lot of alternate fingerings out there. And there's a lot of fingerings that make it much easier to play a line than trying to do like the traditional or this new anchor finger position, especially in terms of like some of the upper note stuff, up some of the things up here. It gets to be a little bit easier when you start doing some of the alternate fingerings. The alternate fingers allow us to move forward, right? So here's our octave or our E, and here's our E as well. You'll notice that if I want to move down and actually get the D, I can do that either by doing this fingering, which would be the D, or in our new alternate fingering, it would be this fingering, which would give me the D. So here's a D in the alternate, and here's a D in the traditional. Again, they're really close to each other, and that's the beauty of alternate fingerings, is allowing us to kind of get these close notes together so that we can move back and forth. And they're important because of the nature of how you want to play and how you want to kind of move forward and perform. Now, the alternate pentatonic is actually really kind of cool because it gives us a different type of tonality. It gives us a different type of world to play in, and different type of like if you think about it as a language, right? It's not necessarily a different language, but it's different. It's a different vocabulary subset that allows us to make a little bit more expressions. So think, we could have it as just a whole new set of words that we're playing around with, is to create these sentences and these structures. And that's the thing that's really exciting about that, is that it is a whole new set of words. It's a whole new set of vocabulary. I'm going to take a sip of water real quick, and I apologize for this. Now, as we move forward in this world of expression, it's kind of important to understand, how do we emphasize and how do we make a word stand out? What is it that we want to say? What is it that we want to land on? And if a note is like a word, how do we make the note a little bit more apparent, or a little bit more meaningful? How do we turn one note into something that is very powerful for us to listen to and very powerful for us to express to, right? So say I want to, just do up and down scale, but I want to end on my fifth. So I want to end on my B here. So I'm going to go, up. Now, I'm doing that thing that we talked about last lesson, and that's called the neighbor tones to the trill, or the trill. And the idea of a neighbor tone and trill allows us to kind of create a wiggle, or kind of multiple notes going fast, to allow us to land on a single note that makes it more meaningful, more powerful. You can hear that when I do that quick trill at the top, bum, 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 that allows me to actually land on the descending pattern and make the note that I hit, this B, much more powerful, because I have that it's going to get that kind of it's going to make it feel like it's more emphasized, because I'm putting a trill in there. Right, that kind of like movement into that note does give us a rather more powerful punch to the feeling, and trills allow us to do that. Now, a trill works on the idea of a neighbor tone, or a neighbor pitch, a neighbor note, right? And we call these things neighbor notes because they are right next to each other, like neighbors in your neighborhood, right? They're one house over here and one house over there, right? So they're right next to you, and these are neighbor tones. Neighbor tones are these notes that are just right next to each other. So there's a here, first position, the second position, that's a neighbor tone, and you can wiggle your finger and actually get a neighbor tone, and that would be would be called the trill. Second position to first position, like we talked about, or second position to third position, that's a way that we can trill. Third again to second, or third to fourth, again we can trill, right? Fifth to fourth, fifth to sixth. That it's just the way that we're close to each other to be able to trill. Now, technically speaking, if you look at the world of neighbor tones, in the world of music, you have your 12 tones: A sharp or B flat, B, C sharp or D flat, D sharp or E flat, E, F sharp or G flat, G sharp or A flat, B flat, A sharp or B flat, B, C. Right, so we actually have the same 12 tones. We're just reusing over again, right? And the official like neighbor tones, the ones that really would be right next to each other, would be those sharps and flats, and those things that are right in between, right? So if I'm on a G, or if I'm playing a G right here, my official or technical neighbor note would be the G sharp, or A flat, or the G flat, or F sharp, right? So I would have to play something like this, which is kind of weird on the fingerings, but you can do. And really, that's kind of like okay, but when you think about it in terms of just like my fingerings here, first position and the second position, that's just moving one finger. So my neighbor tone really is just whatever this note is to this note, right? So it's the E to G on my flute here, on this flute, my E flute. It's be the E to G. So it would be right next to each other, that E to G, that makes it sound like it's pretty simple or pretty easy to get along with, right? And that's kind of cool, because I mean, I don't have to worry about those chromatics. I don't have to worry about all the other little notes. I can if I want to. Like there's parts of me that say, okay, if I really want to get into that stuff, I can. But I mean, I'm just playing with my finger positions here, and so using neighbor tones or these neighbor notes in terms of finger positions means that you don't have to be like so accurate. It doesn't have to be so pinpoint like chromatic to make it work. It can be whatever your notes are. If you're on any instrument, if you have a fingering that takes you from one note to another and it's just a wiggle of a one finger, man, that's a neighbor tone. So trill that sucker. That's cool. Make that work. If it's if you're really close on a piano, or whatever, you want to roll or do something that's a little bit further apart from each other, you can. It's just playing around with these notes repeated back and forth so you can get this kind of trill effect. Now, there is a trill that happens here. And then you can also do something within your throat and everything like that to actually create a trill as well, or a quick little pattern of interspersed break. It's not playing around with pitches, but it is playing around with your breath and your notes. So something inside your mouth that you can do. And this is it's called flutter tonguing, or it's actually called rolling. Guttural roll. So the idea is what you would do, like to roll your R's like you would in, say, like Spanish, arriba, that type of thing. It's that idea that rolling the R allows you to have a little bit more emphasis into the world of a note. It also creates kind of like a buzz effect. So it's kind of like a trill, but it's really only on one note. But you're using your air to kind of make that trilling effect to happen. It's called a flutter tongue, right? It'd be like you saying duku 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 duku. So you're saying coo 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 coo. So duku 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 duku. So if you were to do that, that's kind of the flutter tongue effect. Now I'm doing one with the tongue, and then I'm doing one with the coo effect. So you can get kind of different types of effects with that, how you're performing, and that actually is kind of a neat little emphasis to a note. And that brings us into what we're talking about today, this idea of emphasizing a note. Now, why do we want to emphasize a note? Well, so we talked about two scales, two entirely different scales. And is there a way to use those scales to our advantage and transition back and forth between them without having to always go back down to our initial, right? We've seen that the first three positions are the exact same on each one of the scales, right? So this position, this position, this position, they all work the same. It's not until we actually get to the anchor finger side of things that the notes actually change. So why always go back down to this initial or this so the first position, or go to the second position or third position? Can we do something to maybe transition and make something a little bit more unique, a little bit more different sounding, or a little bit more emphasized by having it on one of the other notes? And the thing is we can, but it's trying to make that note stand out. So it's transitioning between the two scales, but making a single note stand out. I'm going to play, and I'm going to play like I normally do, and just go down to my first position and then change the scales. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to go down to my first position. I'm going to go down to my third position and use that as my emphasis to transition. So the idea here is changing one or two of the notes that you land on so that you can emphasize a motion into a different type of scale or a different type of feeling. And the second pattern I played isn't really as it sounds a little off because it's just the notes may not be the ones that you want to hear as you're transitioning, but if I can make a note stand out, then that might make the transition work a little bit better. So I'm going to go back again and transition on my third position. Okay, but I want to make my third position stand out. So I'm going to do a couple different things. Actually, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to do what's called the repeating note. And I'm just going to land on that note a couple times so that it gets stuck in your head or stuck in your ear. And then I'm going to use that to transition out into the next scale. So first original pentatonic, back to the alternate pentatonic using the third finger position. Ready? Now the repeat. I'm just going to nail that note over and over again and then go back into the alternate pentatonic. So start again. Now, the cool thing about that is by using that kind of repeating note technique, it takes your mind away a little bit, like momentarily, from the actual tonality that we're in, or the original tonality, and allows us to adjust into this new tonality. Very easy, very simple, and that's just kind of utilizing that repeating idea of here's a note that I want to just hammer over and over again to get into this new tonality, so that you don't have to. It's not going to be a big shock to your system. Is the idea, right? That's the cool thing, is by having that kind of repeating idea, that repeating note inside that we're playing, we can move back and forth between the two rather quickly and rather nicely. It's a really simple and easy transition. Now here's a transition I'm going to do using the same type of technique, but this time I'm actually going to change the fingerings around. So I'm going to actually transition on my A, or my A, and to get to the next tonality of where I want to. So starting in the first pentatonic, then moving to second pentatonic, but I'm going to use that same note transition, but I'm going to use this alternate fingering idea to get to it. Okay, so here we go. And that's kind of just an interesting thought, right? Using that kind of alternate fingering to our advantage so we can move back and forth inside these weird tonalities with a little bit different type of idea, a little bit different type of expression, right? It's for you to play around with. It's for you to understand how these things work so that you can create your own music, your own kind of ideas and thoughts behind it. Taking the trill that we learned last week, taking that trill and actually using it to emphasize whatever note we want to go to. Remember, the cool thing about the trill is I can emphasize going down by moving to my neighbor tone on the lower, or I can emphasize going up by moving to my neighbor tone on the up. The idea is that the trill is just that note. It's that wiggle back and forth. So if I want to emphasize going up, I just keep my note on the ascension. If I want to emphasize going down, I keep my note on the close, right? Or keep the emphasis on the close. Now, if I use the trill kind of idea, I can trill into a note to make it more important, right? So, I can make that note more important. And if that note's more important, then I can transition off of that important note into a different tonality to create a little bit different type of expression. I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to, again, start with the original pentatonic and then move into this new pentatonic, but I'm going to trill into a tonality, into an important note, and then use that note to pivot back and forth between the two. Okay, so here we go. So now using that trill kind of emphasis allows me to make that one note stand out, make it a little bit more important, and then use that important note to pivot into this different tonality. Now, I'm using this word pivot because really what it is we're taking one note that is similar in both. Remember, the only thing that's really different between the two pentatonic scales is one note. It's either going to be, this kind of fourth or this fifth, whatever it is that we're going to use inside of it. So it would be in my E flute, it would either be my B or my C. Those are the only notes that are different. So it's trying to find any one of the other notes on my scale or in my flute to use as a focal point so that I can transition into this other tonality and pivot the way you hear things. And this is just trying to keep the pentatonic scales intact. Now, we can talk a lot about actually using both scales together, but for the most part, we just want to talk about these pentatonic scales and trying to keep those intact. So it's this idea of finding a note that we want to transition on and pivot into the other tonality using our anchor fingers, switching up our anchor finger, and then again finding another note that you want to use as the anchor tone to pivot into the original tonality. And the way to emphasize notes is really simple. We showed two different methodologies here. The first method is the idea of just repeating the note over and over again so that the tone gets stuck in your head. Now that right there is a great way to play, and transition, is because you're now getting that note stuck in your head. Then you use that one note to pivot into the next tonality. Or the other way is kind of using this emphasized trill method, which would allow us to wiggle and move onto a note that's more important. And that note now has more emphasis to it, and then utilize that emphasis to help us pivot into it. So by utilizing these two thoughts, we can play around with these two different tonalities in this kind of fashion. So let me just show you something off the top of my head, right? So original, alternate pentatonic, using different types of pivot points or different types of notes. You can see how by utilizing those type of ideas, you can change back and forth and create different types of expressions, different types of ideas for you, right? Create this language that allows you to move in one area, emphasize in one thought, and then move into another paragraph or another moment that can emphasize another thought for you. And that's the thing that's really cool with this kind of concept of tonality, the idea of, one pentatonic and another pentatonic. There's a different type of tonality that goes on there, different type of set of rules in the way our ears understand it. And when you play around with those types of tonalities, it allows us to very easily move back and forth and express a lot more in the world of how we want to say things. Now, it's not that one tonality is better than another tonality, or having to transition between the two is important. It's the fact that it just gives you options, right? It gives you a little bit more ability to be able to say, oh, I want to say something here, and now I want to say something here. Maybe I want my first moments to be in this one time tonality, and then I want you to move with me into this other type of tonality because I want to say something over here, and then to kind of move into another tonality. There's a whole slew of different tonalities. We're going to talk a lot more about those as we move forward because they're really important for the world of expression. But for you and for things that you're working on and the importance of what's happening right now, it's maybe thinking about this pentatonic and this anchor finger a little bit different. having this concept of how do I move back and forth without always having to go to the initial. Maybe I can move back and forth through a different note, and how do I use that note to my advantage? That's what we talked about today. It's kind of utilizing this mechanism of pivoting to our advantage so that we can say things, have things be a little bit more expressive, have things be a little bit more intricate, have them be a little bit more interesting, I guess is another way of saying it. It's not just the same scale up and down, but it's a little bit more. And you can diversify yourself by having a little bit more to be able to utilize and play with. So that's the important thing about today, is trying to get to the idea of emphasis, pivot, and where that can take you inside the world of expression. So I hope you learned something today. I know it's a little bit complicated, a little bit tricky, but I do think that if you can, listen to it and maybe understand this kind of really interesting world of repeating notes to make emphasis, or using the trills to make emphasis, it allows us to have that pivot so that we can move back and forth between the two different types of tonalities. I think that's kind of an interesting thing, an important thing for us to understand as musicians, as performers, and as people who are just creating cool music that we love to play. So thank you very much for coming. I will be here, again, every first Wednesday and third Wednesday of the month. We're doing our lessons. This is lesson number 10, which is exciting because next month we're going to be at our 6-month, kind of world. And at that point, we're going to do some really cool stuff. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for paying attention and listening. And I will see you next time.